What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Marvel's Imperial event, where the Inhumans finally retake their role as one of the major empires of the universe in Marvel Comics. We picked up with that at the end of the last video, and we're continuing with it here. But because it's been a little while since we covered this, Imperial is nothing if not a quarterly event from Marvel Comics, that what's basically happened up to this point is that initially, different members of the heads of the Galactic Council, so basically leaders of galactic empires, were essentially being assassinated. And so the remaining surviving members of the council came together in an effort to figure out who was doing it, only for us to basically witness that Jason of Spartax, the father of Peter Quill and the founder of the Galactic Council, was assassinated himself by what appeared to be a Wakandan. But as the story unfolded, we basically ended up discovering it was this massive complex ruse that was orchestrated by Maximus the Mad, the brother of Black Bolt, the greatest superhero to ever exist, and the Grandmaster. Of course, most of you guys know him as one of the elders of the universe. The whole idea behind this plan was to quite literally destabilize and collapse the Galactic Council so that it could ultimately be reformed, with the Inhumans becoming a part of it. And that's basically what's happening here. But the other part of that is that somewhere between Karla Pachenko's Spider-Woman issues 18 and 19, when Veranki returned, and this, that the idea of Veranki, quote-unquote, restoring the Skrull Empire, so basically going back to its glory days of being conquerors, that's effectively returned. And so what we also ended up learning was that the Wakandan assassin was actually a Skrull. And what the Skrulls had been doing was secretly replacing various individuals throughout the entirety of the Empire. So basically a space-faring version of Secret Invasion. And so this is where the story picks up, because the Skrulls have basically organized themselves, revealed their identities, and they've launched a single combined attack against every empire across the universe in Marvel Comics. And so that's why you pick up with Ronan the Accuser. One of the Stargates was reactivated, and it led to essentially the entirety of the Galactic Council, at least what remains of their forces, traveling through that Stargate and arriving at Wakanda Prime. And so Ronan the Accuser just says, scan and report. And one of the other accusers tells him numerous Skrull frigates surrounding the Fulcrum, which is basically the giant space station where the entire Intergalactic Council meets. And it says, aggressive, low-band chatter, but the station itself is not broadcasting, and we have an alert on the accuser frequency. And so at that point, you switch over to the Shi'ar deck, and we're told the Kree say the station control level is being overrun by Skrulls, and they've captured the rest of the base. And it says the Stargate to Shi'ar space is transmitting a warning. And what they're being told is that it's basically a notice that only Shi'ar citizens are allowed in Shi'ar space because martial law has been enacted across the Empire. Now that is a return to the traditional Shi'ar antics within Marvel Comics. And again, we'll make sense of all of that as we get closer to the end. But one of the things that we learn is that Zandra, the daughter of Lilandra and Charles Xavier, Lilandra, of course, being the ruler of the Shi'ar Empire following the defeat of her brother Daken, that Zandra had basically been deposed, and all Super Guardians are ordered to withdraw and return back to Shi'ar space. So Shi'ar is going back into a state of isolation. And so the meat and potatoes here from Black Panther and his conversation with the Incredible Hulk is, get us to the Fulcrum station and get us onto that place. I will handle the rest. I'm the Incredible Hulk, right? I'm in the business of whooping ass, son. We're in the middle of a war, so business is good. And so at that point, you switch over to the Fulcrum level, where you have a couple of accusers who are fighting off these Skrull invaders. And for the most part, they're able to hold their own, right? Accusers are incredibly powerful. They're literally the most hardened and battle-trained of the Kree at this point in Marvel Comics. And so while they do have a little banter back and forth, right, battle talk, essentially, right, in the coming days, I believe the Hammers of Justice will grow weary, though I fear ours will not be among them, that the other accuser says, fear old age and irrelevance, brother, but never fear death. And the best I can do from here is open the main docking bay and make sure no one else can close it. That while they're doing all of that, Cler shows up. Now here's the thing, if you don't know who Cler is, he is amazing. Super Skrull is dope. He was introduced in Fantastic Four number 18 back in 1963, but basically he's a Skrull that has the powers of the Fantastic Four, but he can shift between those abilities because Skrulls can inherently shapeshift. So when these accusers come charging in to face off against Cler, they're fighting the combined powers of the Fantastic Four at the same time. Cler's been a little finicky in Marvel Comics. Sometimes he's been great, sometimes he's been wholly irrelevant. Usually it's times like this where he shows up and he just kind of operates as something of a battering ram. But notice what he says here, right? When the accusers talk about the idea of being righteous, he asks the question, what do you know of being righteous? You know nothing. And he says, now confess, how do I lock down the station? And he's told, right, you can't. I've jammed the doors open and destroyed the control panel. There will be no escaping justice for you, traitor. And he says, do you think I fear judgment? What a fool you are. And so he's just kind of told by one of the other Skrulls, right? The enemy is here, Cler. What are your orders? And he simply just says, pray, warrior, and prepare for visitors. Because at that point in Fulcrum space, where you have Amadeus Cho, you've got the Incredible Hulk, they come crashing in, right, to the Fulcrum headquarters, right, onto this space station. But while that's happening, Peter Quill, Richard Rider Nova, and Shuri end up coming out of the Stargate and arriving from their mission. Now, they were the ones who figured it out. And in fact, they're seemingly the only ones who know that basically this whole entire war is an elaborate ruse to basically restore the Inhuman Empire. And so that's why when they arrive here, they say it's already started. And it looks like the docking bay smashed. Also, there's only like 100 ships out there. I think we're too late, because they're basically showing up here with a message. You've all been tricked. Everybody has been duped by the Inhumans. Why? Because the Inhumans are just that capable. And so that's why Richard Rider just says, like, there's no time. If we let this battle continue, all these people are going to die, never knowing the truth. So there has to be a way in. And so at that point, you jump to Maximus. And in fact, the Inhumans, right, Maximus the Mad and Black Bolt are watching this whole situation from a stealth ship. And Maximus just says, it looks like everybody's finally here. And he says, but I will say, things blew up nicely, as planned, of course, but still, Ground Zero certainly provides a more robust perspective on the fruits of our labor. It really makes you think about the things that we do and why, doesn't it? What happens to the innocent others in our carefully constructed house of games? And he says, I, dear brother, regret nothing. However, the great King Black Bolt might feel differently. It might even make you get cold feet, or maybe not. Either way, if you're gonna go, you better go now. So Black Bolt, of course, teleports to the ship by way of Lockjaw. And so at that point, you jump back to the Skrulls, facing off against the accusers as the rest of the accusers are invading alongside pretty much all the other forces. Because again, at this point, they're just going after the Skrulls. They think it's just a giant Skrull invasion. And so that's why Black Panther simply says, do not engage except to cut through all the Skrulls. There is no quarter given. There are no praise for mercy that will be answered. He says, we have to get to the command level as quickly as possible. And so at that point, you essentially get a kind of speech where they're told, it is good that you have returned to Fulcrum, the axis around which all spins. Like you heretics, the Skrull scriptures do agree that the universe is vast and expanding, but not uniformly as your holy books and altars to science declare. The all of everything is amorphous and irregular and patterned after the Skrulls, as we are her most loved. And as such, today, we call this place, this time, the center of the universe, a platform for our long-promised ascendance, and into those who far too long have placed themselves above us, be it great warriors or heroes, be it kings and queens who lord over their perceived betters, be it former enemies who played at being brothers, be it our most recent ruler, a boy king who was neither hot nor cold, but a warm idol set up to cover for the sins of those who have long had a boot on our neck. So we welcome you on your return, and we will celebrate the occasion with your death. The goddess wills it. So one of the big things that they're talking about with the idea of ascendance is that it's long since been prophesied that the Skrulls will expand out into the stars. And those prophecies come from a variety of different places, but the most notable example of that comes by way of the Skrulls when they were a peaceful race. There was a time in their early days when they were very barbaric and warlike, but as time began to progress, the Skrulls became more explorers than anything else. That's when they encountered the Kree. But at that point, the Skrull Empire Empire was massive in size, and it was growing day by day. When they encountered the Kree, they offered the Kree the chance to join the Skrull Empire by taking them to the blue area of the moon alongside a race called the Kotati, and then basically having them just construct things based on what they thought would be the most grandeur in their own minds. And where the Kotati built a kind of lush jungle, the Kree ended up building a grand citadel in honor of the Skrulls. But because the Skrulls were peaceful, they weren't really interested in ingratiating or anything like that. And so ultimately, they sided with the Kotati. That pissed the Kree off. The Kree killed the Skrull delegation, wiped out the Kotati on the moon, reverse engineered Skrull technology, and then basically became an interstellar empire, and the war between the Kree and the Skrull began. When that happened, the Skrull descended back into madness. But ever since then, right, ever since that time when they had the idea of expanding into the universe and conquering it all, different rulers have always popped up promising the restoration of Skrull grandeur. One day, we will rule everything. During Secret Invasion, it was conquering Earth and then spreading out into the universe from Earth. Here, it's a secret invasion of the Universal Empires and expanding out from there, seizing control of the Galactic Council, and then the universe just kind of becomes theirs to control, even if by no other means than politics. So again, these are very important elements for the Skrulls. The other part of this is when they're talking about the boy king who was ruling them, that's a byproduct of Empire. That there was a time in Marvel where they were trying to reshuffle and rework the cosmic landscape, which truly had just kind of been in a state of stagnation since Dan Abnett stopped writing it all. And so what Empire did is it brought in Hulkling, who's both Kree and Skrull, and essentially unified both empires under his rule. What this is doing is it's establishing that the Skrulls were part of that alliance, if only tenuously. And now that Veranki is back, quote unquote, and they can return back to their age of splendor and they can finally achieve their role of ascendance, there's no need to honor the delegation anymore. And so now they're trying to seize control of it all. At that point, you jump back over to Peter Quill, Nova, and Shuri. And while they're literally trying to cut through the bulkhead of the space station so they can get into this place, once they're inside, the plan becomes pretty simple. That Peter Quill just says, okay, right, we have to head straight to the command level, and then we'll take over comms and reveal that the Skrulls have been set up by the Inhumans. We just have to put an end to all of this. And he says, under no circumstances are we to engage in any firefights. We do not have the time, only for them to turn a corner and immediately be met by just a ton of Skrulls. So the firefight happens. There's no way to avoid it. Anybody who's been reading Marvel Comics long enough will tell you the plans of Peter Quill and Nova usually never work out in their favor. Not because they suck, but because, you know, they have bad luck. But the fact is, while they're launching their strike, the Incredible Hulk and Amadeus Cho are launching their strike as well. Black Panther's on board the station, launching his strike, and so then you switch over to Ronan the Accuser and Super Skrull. Now this is particularly important because this is essentially two of the most powerful members of opposing factions. So in a lot of ways, it is essentially the very way in which Kree and Skrull view each other. And so that's why Ronan says, tell me, Cler, what's it like pretending to serve the Empire while hiding nothing but hate in your heart? And Cler just says, you are wrong, Ronan. I had nothing but love and a willingness to serve. I abased myself and our empire, and then she showed me the truth. And that's where Ronan just says, the truth is that you are a traitor and nothing else. And Cler asks him, and what are you? You sit in judgment of others, sifting truth from lies. So tell me the truth. How much do you really hate my people? And Ronan just says, with the entirety of my loyal Kree heart. So there is no having these two groups work together. And seemingly, there never was. And so that's why Cler says, and that is what the goddess showed me. Ronan the Accuser, you have been judged. But at that point, Amadeus Cho and Hulk show up, and that's when all hell starts to break loose, because all these guys just start getting crushed. The Incredible Hulk is enough to be able to do it, at least you would expect that. But with Black Bolt entering the fray, alongside Star-Lord and Peter Quill and Shuri, it's total pandemonium. It's chaos here, right? Quite literally, it's all against all. And so that's why when Richard Rider and Star-Lord and Shuri get a moment of reprieve, Peter Quill just says, I don't get it, Rich, right? We tried to to explain what's really going on, how they've all been tricked, but they don't want to listen. And that's where Richard Rider is like, don't you know? They would rather believe the lie than face the truth. The Kree and the Skrull hate each other, so they're looking for any reason to go to war against one another. And so that's why Shuri is just like, the only thing I know is we have to get to the command level. So at that point, we get this really cool monologue where it says, the empires numbered their citizens in the trillions, and as hundreds of thousands wagered their lives in the space outside Fulcrum, the future of all these worlds would be determined inside by only 4 beings: a king, a warlord, a prophet, and the last of them, the hidden hand of change, who was, in all the ways that matter, responsible for all that happened leading up to this day. Were those acts simply self-serving, or were they just evil? Can anyone tell the difference when you bite the lies hard enough to taste the greater good? These monstrous deeds, their ambitious desires of the powerful and self-righteous, perhaps they're simply too big to comprehend, too complicated to judge, when there are no innocents in the room, be it revenge, be it righteous fervor, be it control, or ravenous ambition. All these acts are scandals, crimes, and sins. The real question is, will there be some kind of eternal judgment or kingly price paid? That would depend entirely on who is victorious, for history is written by the winners, and the truth always arrives too late. Because that's the cool thing about this, right? There is merit to the statement that a lie travels around the world faster than the truth ever will. Because once people make up their minds about a fact, it's almost impossible to change it. And so what this does is it picks up 1 week after the defeat of the Skrulls. Specifically with Shuri, Richard Rider, and Peter Quill. And in this conversation, Richard Rider asks the question, what do you mean he considers the matter settled? And Shuri just responds, I told T'Challa everything we learned, who we believe was behind this, and how they benefited. And he's decided to simply just let it go. As when accounts were settled, we've benefited more. And that's where Richard Rider is just like, that's a pretty universal we, Shuri, when what you really mean is you. And she's honest with him. She says, yeah, that's exactly who I'm talking about. Because whether it is Wakanda out there in Africa, or it's the intergalactic empire out here in space, at the end of the day, Wakanda still essentially operates the same. They operate largely in isolation, and if they do lend their resources out to people out there, it's for the purpose of doing it in a way that solidifies their control. Hence the Wakandan Stargates, right? That with the Wakandan Stargates, they became a necessity. If Wakanda were to simply deactivate the Stargates, interstellar travel becomes much longer and far more complicated. And so Richard Rider asks, right, how do you even measure something like that, right? Do any of the people who have lost something or someone even get a voice during all of this? And Shuri just says, for me, Nova, there's really only one voice that matters. And where he asks her what she's talking about, she says, we have tried all of that. We Wakandans, we tried democracy and councils and every other fair political structure that rejected our traditional aristocracy and elevated the people. But what we have learned is that building an empire is very specific, particularly brutal work. It is hard decisions followed by impossible ones, and expecting that to be done by politicians, that requires trusting them not to see themselves as secret little aristocrats themselves. What a perfect dream that is, and upon waking, a total nightmare. So we have returned to the old ways, and there T'Challa stands, born and raised to be the strong man. A choice had to be made, and my brother made it. And so Richard Rider asks her, but knowing what we know, can you live with that, right? Knowing that this entire council is now built on a lie. So many dead because the Inhumans tricked everyone. And Shuri just simply says, he's the greatest man I've ever known. And he has the decency not to wash the blood off of his hands. So I accept his sins as he accepts mine. He's not a god, but he is my king. I wish you both well. And ultimately, walks away. And so at that point, Richard turns to Peter and he's like, so then it's up to us, right? We have to be the voices of reason, and we have to let everybody know what happened here, right? The Inhumans cannot get away with this. But Richard doesn't get the answer he expects. That Peter's just kind of like, I mean, you have to understand, right? This idea, the Union, It was my father's vision, and I feel obligated to see it through. So he holds the lie, right? He's just kind of like, we got to sweep it under the rug, man. And that's really interesting here because this is classic game theory. That's really all this is, right? And here's the reason why I say this. Let's say, for example, that Richard Rider and Peter Quill agreed and they went out and they told everybody the truth. Well, only two things are going to happen. Either people are going to ignore it. They're just not really going to care because they're like, hey, look, I mean, things are fine, right? It's like getting a steak, right? Nobody really cares how the cow is treated. All they care is how the steak tastes. They might say they care about how the cow is treated, but when you're sitting at that restaurant and you order a ribeye steak medium rare, you don't ask the server how the cow was treated. That never comes across your mind. The other part here is that people could learn the truth and they could realize they don't trust their leaders. And then it could just lead to like universal rebellion, literally citizens in every empire turning against their rulers. So what's the benefit here? What's the upside in making this revelation? But for Richard Rider, it's more about corruption. It's more about a lie being the basis for all of this. And that's why he says no, right? That's not happening. You really think that this won't stop? Like, do you really think that this is where it's going to end? That this final lie will be the last lie and that everything that comes forward is truth? No. The more you lie, the easier it becomes. And so that's why Peter just tells him, you can't do that, Richard. Acts of political will, actions like this, when they are announced, it's a formality. All the deals have already been made. The deed is done. I really am sorry, right? But look, right, I know what this cost you, so you don't have to worry about the world mind or having the money to keep it on. I've got you covered, right? It's the least that I can do for a friend. And of course, Richard Rider rejects Peter Quill and just says, don't ever call me friend again, and walks away. At that point, you switch over to Amadeus Cho and the Incredible Hulk. What's kind of interesting about this is that She-Hulk is still over on Sakaar. She was essentially babysitting the planet, keeping it from falling into an extreme state of civil war that the Incredible Hulk's son, Hero Kala, was one of the individuals who had been killed. And so because he had like all these wives and each one represents a tribe and all the tribes are like vying for control of Sakaar, again, civil war. And so all this really does is it sets the stage for the Incredible Hulk to return to Planet Hulk, which we know is already happening. Except this time, it'll be the Hulk, Amadeus Cho, and She-Hulk together. And so at that point, you switch over to the Inhuman city ship of Attilan. And Maximus just says, that is a look of satisfaction. And why wouldn't you be satisfied? A place at the table, a righting of old wrongs, a reset of the old ways. And more than all of that, a return of the king. We've accomplished so much, and it's impressive really, what could be next? And Medusa says, for us, Hala and the Empire. So the Kree are returning to their role as rulers of Hala, basically ruling over the Kree race. For Maximus, not so much, because what ends up happening is Medusa reveals to Maximus that according to the decree of Black Bolt, Maximus is to be exiled, which on the surface seems like a massive betrayal. Had it not been for Maximus, none of this would have happened. The Inhumans never would have returned to power in the first place. And so that's why Maximus says, I tell you truly, brother, this is the coldest act you have ever done. You cut me deeply and I bleed. And I have never been more proud, because Maximus is insane. He's like the Loki of the Inhumans. And he just says, you will need me again. You'll see. And when you do, brother, I will be here waiting with love in my heart. And so 2 days after that, you pick up with this kind of announcement, right? As projected, but quicker than expected, the Galactic Council earlier today voted into existence the Galactic Union, excluding the Shi'ar, who've abandoned all diplomatic associations, and the Skrull Empire, whose membership has been rejected. The vote was virtually unanimous, with only the Kree temporarily abstaining. Also worth noting is that the celebration of the Union was the singular vision of the recently deceased Jason of the Spartoi, so it's only fitting that the first head of the organization is his son. And so for Wakanda, the question becomes, what's their role in all of this? And seemingly the intergalactic empire of Wakanda isn't going anywhere. Marvel's not getting rid of it. What they are doing is they're seemingly expanding it, because Shuri asked the question to T'Challa, what's next, right? What are you planning? Like, what do we do? And he just asks her, what's next? He says, take a look. And he just shows her the stars. So the intergalactic empire of Wakanda is going to become far more significant than it had before. But here's why I say all of this is seemingly returning to a state of status quo. Empire reshuffled a lot of what Marvel did with their spacefaring escapades. The problem is that no one ever did anything with it. Marvel launched Empire, the space landscape was changed, and then it just sat over there. And that was it. That the harsh reality here is that Marvel's cosmic landscape simply has not been the same since Dan Abnett left. It just hasn't been anywhere as good. Annihilation, Annihilation Conquest, Thanos Imperative, right? Those were all phenomenal stories. And so this is setting everything back to the way that it was before. Here's where things get cool. Because Peter Quill kind of talks to his dad, right? And, this disembodied figure, right? And he just says, I understand that the accuser class has a growing number of questions that they want answered, and so far have refused to embrace Black Bolt until they get those answers. And then there are rumors. One is that there's some kind of messianic Kree from another universe where they're more powerful than the Kree are here. More advanced, more cunning, more everything. He's spreading the word of a better future, and the people are listening. This is Novar. This is Marvel Boy. And I never thought that I would see Grant Morrison's work returning. I'm excited to see where this goes, to be honest with you. He's not really a villain, right? If anything, he's actually a Kree whose DNA is spliced with cockroaches. I know it sounds weird. It was like Grant Morrison's attempt to make like a Kree version of Spider-Man, right? To be honest with ourselves. But the other rumor is simply stated as being too dark for the Kree to speak aloud. It's all whispers and dread at this point. One word, Vel, with twin meanings. So this is clearly Phyla-Vell, but that looks like genus Vel. And if it is, I'm excited to see it because he's crazy, but who knows if he's going to come back as like a sane person. I have no clue where Marvel's going with all of this. Technically, Phyla-Vell returned in exile, so that's how we know it's her. But I'm excited to see where this goes because then Peter just says, on the good news front, I know all this because I have some very smart, very well-paid Kree scientists working for me right now. It seems there's hope for Victoria. There's no cure yet, and she's stabilized, and perhaps with a little luck and a whole lot of prayer, she can have her seat back. So until then, heavy is the crown, Dad. Rest in peace and long live the Union. Because Peter Quill now runs the council that oversees all the empires across the universe. Not only that, this sets in motion a whole bunch of story arcs for the future of Marvel's cosmic landscape. It's a soft reboot of the Marvel cosmic line. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoy this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.